Testing, testing. Green light.
Testing, testing.
We'll find out when I get out there.
Yep.
It may not pick up in here, but it should pick up in there.
Break your leg all.
You.
Probably I will, but
Okay. Sting it.
yes, madam. Me
No,
as
you
well.
don't need, you just need the lectern.
Well, I'm not gonna hold it. I hope. I mean, if that's an option, I'll certainly explore it. No, hold it.
It works. Mark.
Does this room always smell like a toilet? Well, the whole area. Is that our, good for you. Might be your.
Smells like a sewer back. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Lorraine Key, in case we haven't met. I'm a member of the Pursuing Racial Justice Committee. And some of you may remember way back when, it feels like forever ago, but about a year or so ago, or maybe two, we did a project talking about reparations and reconciliation. And out of that project, that Linton project, has grown a bigger project. Part of that bigger project is telling the stories that we sometimes don't get when we're looking at the history of the cathedral. So that's what we're going to be sharing with you today. Maybe elements that you did not know, so that we can get a full picture of what our history is. I also want to add, the play is, or dramatization is set in the 1800s. Slavery was, thriving, and people were sadly living in a world where slaves obviously, if they ran away, for example, or were in the mind of their owners, not, working like they wanted them to, they could get beaten. Fortunately for us, at the cathedral, we have evidence that there were indeed slaves that were part of our history. So today, we're going to give you a little bit of that, so you can think about that as part of your whole vision of the history of this building, the history of this cathedral. I also want to add that after it's over, we're going to have a brief discussion about the dramatization. So without further ado, the dramatization.
Some of what you're about to hear is taken from Elizabeth Keckly's autobiography, Behind the Scenes. Other exchanges are based on Sue Rekoff's research of the archives of the Diocese of Missouri, as well as excerpts from William Schuyler's biography of his father, Reverend Montgomery Schuyler. The period before the Civil War was a time of great suffering for the many African-American enslaved people who lived under the oppression perpetrated by their owners. Missouri found itself as a border state supporting slavery as a part of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that brought Missouri into the Union. We were, in essence, a slave state. In our cathedral archives, there are records of the many parishioners who participated in the growth and life of Christ Church, and also records of enslaved peoples who were property of some of those church members. This is the story of one of those people, an enslaved woman who suffered unspeakable pain at the hands of those who took advantage of her, and how she lived not only to experience freedom, but to document her life in her own words.
I was born in 1818 in February at DeWitt Courthouse. My master, Reverend Burwell, and his wife had a daughter, a sweet, black-eyed child who would later become my fondest pet. I was 4, only a child myself, when it was decided that I would care for the child. I was taught and raised in a hearty school where I was taught to rely on myself and sometimes often to render assistance to others. My mistress encouraged me to take care of the baby by rocking the baby in its cradle. And I was told that if I could take care of the baby, keep the flies out of her eyes, and just make sure she stayed quiet, that I could become its little maid. I took this job seriously, and when I vigorously rocked the cradle back and forth, I cried out, "Oh no, the baby's on the floor." I took the fire shovel and I tried to pick up the baby and put it back into the cradle, but the mistress was very upset with me and yelled at me to go out to the yard for my lack of carelessness. When I was 18, I had the job of 3 servants. Even though they had great disdain, I was often sent to other men to get beaten. Reverend Burwell himself had he had great disdain of my lack of responsibility in my spirit. And then he promised to never strike me another blow. I then was sent to go live with his daughter and her husband, and they were poor. They moved to St. Louis to have a better cost of living. And that didn't work out for them. I had met Mr. Keckly in Virginia, and he followed me to St. Louis to ask my hand in marriage. He had claimed to be a free man.
truth was that a significant number of our congregation in the 1850s were slave owners. As much as we would like to think that our clergy had always been forward thinkers and on the side of justice,
Bishop Hawks and I had several discussions about the state of our congregation and the state of the world.
Reverend Scholar, how are things with our congregation?
All right.
These are very difficult times, as you know. Volatile times. For the church, for our church.
Yes, I know.
I must tell you, very sensitive, very volatile times. We're at a difficult point. I'll be blunt with you. There are many members of this congregation who would leave if we were to take an anti-slavery stance. You of all people know we are just barely getting by. You know that many members of our congregation own slaves. This is not the time to rock the boat.
Bishop, I think you must know that even my wife supports secession. She will be on the side of the slave states in the fight. But it is my belief that this country cannot be divided because of this issue.
Agreed.
Although apprehensive about the election of Abraham Lincoln 2 years later in 1860, Montgomery Schuller still hoped the Union could be preserved, as well as the practice of slavery.
Mr. Keckly had long sought my hand in marriage, and I had long turned him down. But then we were wed, and we had a son. But James lied, and I was faced with bringing another mouth into slavery.
Elizabeth's success as a seamstress allowed her to buy freedom for her and her son. After several years of abuse, Elizabeth left James Keckly, took her son, and moved to Washington, D.C. Her reputation as a seamstress had preceded her, and soon she found work in the employ of the First Lady of the United States, Mary Todd Lincoln. Elizabeth Keckly's son, George, died at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, August 10th, 1861. Elizabeth had difficulty establishing her son's racial identity, but eventually received her son's pension. Later in life, when she was unable to work, it was her only source of income.
I finally gained freedom with funds that I had raised myself. Although I am not a child any longer, I'm on the shady side of 40. But I am free. What a glorious sound to the word. Free. The bitter struggle was over. Free. I was free.
Tim O'Brien. I am Howie Hirschfield. This is Ebony Easter, and our narrator, Mark Waite.
What kind of time do I have left? How much time do we have? Okay. So, we're going to put you to work a little bit. I'm just going to ask first for any reactions that you might have just had to the play dramatization. It's based on our history, and part of what PRJ is doing is telling the story of the cathedral more fully. Anybody, just any general comments? Hey, Mary, would you mind standing?
Speaking to this? Okay, that one's not turned on. I really liked the pauses that Elizabeth gave us to sort of think about what you were saying. And the words seem very simple, but also so true. So the pauses really helped me to see that and feel it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was listening to On the Media this morning, and they were talking about erasing history. And as uncomfortable as it might be, we can't erase our history. We need to confront it.
One of the words that I have heard, one of the phrases I've heard in our current era is to not push the envelope, or to not rock the boat, or to just let things be for just right now. And if not now, then when? This dramatization really brought that home for me. Now, transtemporally, and all those other words, now is the time. Thank you.
Well, what I know about history is that some people took meticulous notes. They wrote these articles, they wrote books. And then there were people that were like, but this didn't happen. Or we don't want to talk about it. But I'm like, you wrote a whole book about it. You wrote an article, there was a newspaper article, there was this and that. And somebody else maybe wrote their story. And it's like, white supremacy telling me that it didn't happen, but then you took notes. You had a log about who was on the boat, who died on the boat, but it didn't happen? Really? Okay. I'd like to see how long that story is going to be hidden, because at a certain point, you just can't hide everything. There's not enough space in a closet, in a basement. It's all going to have to come out at a certain point. So I appreciate all the people that have written those meticulous notes, and all the people that have gone to research those notes and put them out here for us to hear, because our stories are as important as any other story. And to understand that we, people that look like me, Black people, have contributed to this story. And if you go to Washington, D.C. and have a chance to go to the African American Museum, I encourage any and everyone to go, because when you see that you are a part of history, when I saw that I was a part of history, I just couldn't, I had never stood so tall. I was taller than that building, and my heart grew, and I learned so much about my people, who are the people of exception. There was always some, I'll teach you to read, I'll teach you to do these things. So if we can't take something from that, I don't know what we can take from.
I wanted to mention something that came about during the research that Lorraine and I were doing for this piece. Most of the words you heard, by the way, are Elizabeth Keckly's own words from her autobiography. speaking in her own language, in her own words. We discovered some interesting things. I had thought that I had read that Dean Schuyler was an abolitionist. And he may have been, but if so, it was something he kept very private. The speech between Bishop Hawkes and Reverend Schuyler was much more on point. Dean Schuyler's son wrote a biography of his father, and in which he said that the bishop and Reverend Schuyler had just this discussion. We compressed it a bit, but pretty much saying that to be safe, to be on the safe side, and also to keep our congregation alive, we could not take a stance against slavery, regardless of how their personal feelings may have been. They could not do it. The congregation at the time, pre-Civil War, was struggling to get by, and to lose as many members as they would have to come out against slavery could have been a death knell to our church. So they didn't do it. No matter how they really felt, it did not happen.
I think it also, we should also point out, sometimes it gets lost in Mrs. Keckly's story, that she was a dear, trusted friend to the Lincolns, specifically to Mary Todd, poor, tortured Mary Todd. All the things that she endured, even after leaving the White House, she stayed with her, and Abraham Lincoln loved her. Mrs. Keckly handled her for him often. But there was a true friendship there, and I think that bears noting as well.
And something else we discovered in researching this was that in Elizabeth Keckly's book, she spends a lot of time talking about, in her later years, how Mary Todd Lincoln had almost nothing. And at that time, and it happened often that the wife of a former president had a very difficult time getting any kind of funds appropriated, and it had to go through Congress, and Congress wouldn't approve it. So Mary Todd Lincoln went to auction houses in Chicago, where she had moved, and she was turned down over and over. She had belongings that we would look at it and go, oh my goodness, these are things that that are valuable, they're historical, and she could not sell them. And it was Elizabeth Keckly who got involved in the process because of the clout she had by that time to go ahead and write letters, and she wrote letters to the auction houses, and finally there was an auction held, and Mary Todd Lincoln sold most of her belongings, which came out to the sum of about $20,000, and this is in 1875, which was what she was able to live on for the remainder of her life. They helped each other.
Okay, question number 2. I'm going to make it a little harder for you. So when I went up to the archives a couple of years ago with Paul Anderson, and there, Paul, we were looking at the records. We've got, ledgers, is what I would call them, of, the year, the date, somebody's name, whether they were baptized or married or any of the sacraments. And I came across one that said Harriet and her son James. James was baptized. But it made note of the fact that this was a slave. I came across another set of names, Augustus Brown and Ellen Carver, and they had gotten married, and it also listed them as slaves. So in my heart, I thought about, well, great, the Episcopal Church married them. But then, you come across a story like Elizabeth Keckly, who was married by our clergy, and it's in somebody's parlor, not in this building. So, I've gone on a little bit of a journey about what I think about the listing of the word slave in the or the records, the archives, the ledgers. But I'm interested in what you think about that. Anybody want to speak to that?
Lorraine,
Yes.
I know I've spoken with you a bit about it, but to me, that was a real instance of what history you're going to tell. And the way I reacted to it was like most white people would, was, oh, how lovely. We married these poor little slaves in our church. Isn't that great? And Lorraine pointed out to me, no, it was not in the nave of the church. It was in someone's parlor. And I thought, that's what they left out in the archive, or maybe it was there in the archive, I'm not sure. But when it gets retold in white spaces, they conveniently leave that out. And that's a way of skewing real history. And I just thought to myself, yeah, epiphany. So anyway.
Maybe I should know this from previous discussions upstairs, but were enslaved people congregational members?
I wish Rob was standing here. I don't believe so, but I don't know the answer to that. Part of the Pursuing Racial Justice projects that grew out of our Lenten series, was that 2 years ago? My memory
Last
year. Okay, it feels longer. But regardless, we're going to be digging into some of that history as much as we can. The truth is, we're fortunate to have Elizabeth Keckly's autobiography, but most slaves were not writing autobiographies. So we have to do a deep dive into the research to find out a lot of information. And somebody earlier mentioned how much folks wrote down some of this stuff, but the truth is, it's mostly from the perspective of, white Americans, about what happened. So, my excitement and our committee's excitement and PRJ's excitement is about uncovering that. So, I would love to find out whether they were actual members. We know they're part of our history because they're in the books. But I agree, I'd like to, as much as we can, dig into that a lot more and see, where, they were involved. Did anybody ever get elected senior warden? Did, when that happened, what was the reaction of the congregation when there, was more integration? But it's a good question, Orrin, and I hope we get into it someday. So I'll get back to you.
Oh, I just was going to say that I think it was designated and identified so they wouldn't be included in the Sunday count with the regular congregation members. Maybe they had a separate count for slaves in attendance or whatever the case may be. But when they did the roll call, they could swing it either way, depending on who they were giving their numbers to. Our congregation is this, and then somebody else might say, oh, by the way, we had a few little others in attendance. So I think it was political and appropriate for the time because it identified and kept everything separate.
There were certainly churches in the country that could be considered to support the abolitionist movement, and there were free men, not so many women, but free men in certain northern states, some of them. Missouri was just not one of those places. And Bishop Hawks, this conversation he has with Reverend Schuyler is very much on point to the political nature of the fact that we couldn't stand up in any way for these people. I wonder if perhaps as they came to church with the families that owned them, but they were not official, they were not full in any way, full congregants. But like Lorraine says, as we integrated after the war and over time, became easier, but at this time, 1840s, 1850s, 1860, very different culture, even here. Well, not different than the rest of the country, but not what we've come to expect.
I just have to speak to this. We're talking about how this is over a century old, a century and a half old. And I'm here to say this goes on still. You know, and it wasn't more than 2 years ago that someone in our diocese said they wouldn't be bringing up or looking into the history of their particular church just yet, because they've already lost some members. They don't want to lose anymore. So, and it didn't just happen 150 years ago. It's still going on. People are still denying what the truth is.
So I think history shows us that black people couldn't vote. They were, what, 3/5 of the person? Why would they be 100% members of a church? And also, we know that people use the Bible to control people and to say things and to keep people in a particular place, and we still are, some of us, not here maybe, but, you know, heck, I'm at Biddle House, and I hear people using the Bible and using Bible verses, but I'm like, boy, you can't even get a job. But you talking using the Bible and talking about how somebody's the devil? I'm like, I don't know. You might want to clean under your bunk and clean out your heart and think about what you're saying. You know, threatening my life, but then using a Bible verse, the math ain't mathing. So, you know, I feel like that making that designation, so-and-so is a slave. We point that out so we know. So somebody knew, but, you know, numbers have power. So we have this many people here, and, well, we know what the real ledger says. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Thank you.
History tends, in my mind, this is no revelation to anybody, but it echoes. You know, it echoes in the way we welcome people to the cathedral. There's a member that told me some time ago, and this was many years ago, but it was in the 1800s, where they had come to the cathedral and someone pointed out to them that there was a black church in the diocese, if they might be interested in that. And that, you know, I'm gonna guess, obviously that's in the last 50 years or so, at least. So, we're not there yet, and honestly, the political climate is not so good right now when it comes to race in this country. So, when people think that, you know, it has nothing to do with me, or it's not in my backyard, or all those other things, it, you know, it echoes every day with, you know, poor schools and poor neighborhoods, people not being able to buy houses where they want to buy houses, people being turned down for jobs because they have funny names. So history does echo. I'm going to assume that we're close to the 20 minutes being over. We want to thank you so much for attending. We've got lots of ideas for how to tell stories in the future. I want to thank our actors again. I want to thank Rob with the research and Kathy for letting us do it. Thanks again. Bye.